Hey everybody, this is the last chapter that I'll be reading because there's no more chapters left besides this one from Peter Beilharz, Trotskyism and the Transition to Socialism. This piece is titled Political Economy and Transition, Ernest Mandel. I want to look up Ernest Mandel, probably one of the most well-known Marxists of the 20th century. He's been dead for a little while, so it says Ernest Ezra Mandel, who wrote under names such as Ernest Germain, Pierre Gousset, Henri Valin, and Walter. Lived from 1923 to 1995. Was a Belgian Marxian economist, Trotskyist activist and theorist, and Holocaust survivor. Mandel fought in the underground resistance against the Nazis during the occupation of Belgium. So, to the text now. Ernest Mandel is probably the best known of all contemporary Trotskyists, one of the most influential of modern Marxist economists. He figures on the left today. Few figures on the left today create such controversy, attract such adoration and vilification. Mandel is the theoretical and political leader of the United Secretariat of the Fourth International. Ernest Mandel's arguments remain among the most hegemonic in the revolutionary left today. Born in 1923, Mandel became a revolutionary in 1939, joining the Trotskyist movement in his native Belgium in 1940. Ernest Mandel was active in the resistance throughout the occupation. In 1946, under the pseudonym of Ernest Germain, Ernest Mandel was elected to the leadership of the Fourth International. So he would have been, 23 years old? Throughout the 50s and 60s, Mandel was active in the Belgian trade union movement and in the Belgian Socialist Party, within which the Trotskyists then operated. He edited La Gauche, organ of the Socialist Party left, before the Trotskyists were expelled from the party in 1965. An astute dialectician within the Fourth International, Mandel became known as one who changed his positions with ease, rarely pausing to reconcile such shifts with his earlier positions. Mandel is also the author of works of considerable scholarly achievement, most notably Marxist Economic Theory and Late Capitalism. Ernest Mandel's works have been published in 30 languages and range from journalism and programmatic materials to economic treatises and criticism, from sophisticated scholarly interventions to crude Trotskyist polemics. It is this combination of scholarly and political practices which sets Mandel apart from his peers and which often produces strange effects in, quote, revolutionary journalism and, quote, revolutionary scholarship, end quote. For there is a strong tendency in Mandel to append rhetorical conclusions to substantially empirical and non-revolutionary works. Similarly, Ernest's theoretical writings, like Late Capitalism, traverse all manner of economic terrains, only to issue unexpectedly in scenarios of socialist revolution which have no recognizable relationship to the preceding analysis. The tension between science and revolution is by no means evident to Mandel, whose Trotskyist traits include a fundamentalism in which science is held to, quote, prove, end quote, the positions of orthodox Marxism, whether basic or modified. For Mandel, science itself is a revolutionary weapon, and nowhere is this more clear than in his attempt to apply Marx's 1859 preface, a scheme which on historical judgment explains social stability rather than change. In order to prove the, quote, inevitability, end quote, of socialist revolution, integrated into Mandel's theory of long waves of capitalist development, Mandel's particular variation of the forces relations formula provides an illustrative case of innovation within the parameters of orthodox Marxism. New section, Mandel's relation to Trotsky. Mandel's Trotsky, a study in the dynamic of his thought, is little more than hagiography. Trotsky is viewed as the source of the basic truths of modern revolutionary Marxism. Trotsky is credited with a power of prophecy. Trotsky takes on an aura of infallibility. Come on. Sorry, the screen's not working right. Such problems as are acknowledged in Trotsky's Marxism are reduced to questions of mistaken timing or miscalculated prediction. Mandel's admiration is more fulsome for the Bolshevik Trotsky. His attitude towards the young Trotsky is a compromised, vehement yet ambivalent rejection. As Mandel is attracted to the early Trotsky's spontaneism, yet repulsed by his anti-Leninism. On balance, Mandel prefers the image of the Bolshevik Trotsky, where spontaneous working-class energy is viewed in Trotskyist manner as a steam which is dissipated in the absence of a party piston. Mandel's substantive affinities with Trotsky are many and varied, but are now nowhere more apparent than in basic principles. Mandel's anthropological perspectives shift variously from the nature of the subject matter at hand and with the scope of projection. When speaking specifically of people as they are and might be, Mandel espouses a labor ontology, viewing the capacity to perform creative work as a basic characteristic of human nature. This labor ontology produces a basic humanism manifested in the naive argument that what people may make, they can also unmake. Such sentiments are combined with many others. In one place, Mandel suggests a dualistic anthropology based on class. The bourgeoisie are by nature competitive, while proletarians are naturally cooperative. In other places, Mandel reduces the argument for socialism to a statement of, quote, faith, end quote, in the positive anthropology. In discussing problems of transition, however, Mandel introduces the negative anthropology, arguing that people will strive for better things only under a regime which offers material rewards. These contradictory positions find their explanation in the Trotskyist determinism, which understands egoism as the product of scarcity and altruism as the result of abundance. Mandel thus views history as the history of the struggle for surplus, as surplus is the condition of existence for class society and subsequently for socialism. Mandel's choice of the revolutionary subject capable of achieving such a society is strongly influenced by the Jacobin dimension of Trotskyism. As Mandel himself puts it in one place, the proletariat must emancipate itself, yet only the party can achieve liberation. This additional level of association is characteristically Trotskyist. Mandel's general debt to Trotsky is evident in his basic working categories, which are those of dialectical and historical materialism. Under the pressure of the renewed criticism of the Marxist Renaissance, Mandel has been obliged to articulate these positions with more clarity than Trotsky ever did. Significantly, however, the result is little improvement on Trotsky's own positions. For Mandel, dialectical materialism's basic premise is that everything changes and is in perpetual motion. This premise is taken to be a universal truth. Quote, motion, universal motion governs all existence, end quote. This universal motion involves the dialectics of nature as well as those of history and, in addition, the dialectics of knowledge. Dialectical materialism is the only exception to this rule. Dialectical materialism never changes. Mandel outlines the categories of dialectical logic, the unity and contradiction of opposites, quantitative and qualitative change, negation and surpassing. Contradiction is explained as internal in character, as is content to form. Here Mandel offers the significant illustration of the contradiction between forces and relations of production. As will be seen below, the principle of internal contradiction is a binding thread of Mandel's Marxism, one which concludes in his theory of endogenous technological revolutions. For it follows from Mandel's first principle concerning motion that, quote, all motion is a function of the internal contradictions of the phenomenon or a set of phenomena under consideration, end quote, Mandel. The epistemological basis of, quote, automatic Marxism, end quote, and the theory of permanent revolution is here already set in motion. Dialectical materialism functions in Mandel's work as the basis of a science which aspires ultimately to an empirical status. The status of Marxism itself is viewed as ultimately empirical. Though Mandel's own Marxism shifts steadily between fact and fancy, Mandel views social science as the empiricist practice of fact-gathering. Social science is understood here as a parallel practice to natural science. Arguing against Gauche, Mandel claims to accept Hilferding's division of Marxism into science and revolution. Mandel argues that Marxism is meaningless if understood as anything other than science, and science of a most particular kind. Symptomatically, he echoes Engels' claim that empirical proof is the final tribune of epistemology. Mandel makes clear his belief in Marxism as a predictive science, implying a literal image of crisis where, in accordance with traditional medical meaning, the specialist diagnoses and awaits the further decline of the patient, world capital. The sequence of Mandel's logic is clear. Science can only be revolutionary if science tells the truth. Revolution is written into the order of things. Therefore, an accurate science cannot but be revolutionary. Mandel's first principles are further clarified in his explanation of the canons of historical materialism. Marxism is explained as a socio-economic determinism, quote, in the last instance, end quote. Quote, historical materialism is a determinist doctrine, end quote. Mandel explains, quote, its fundamental thesis affirms that it is social existence which determines social consciousness, end quote. History for Mandel unfolds through a dialectic of forces and relations of production. Each mode of production grows like a human being through phases of vigor and sterility. The scope of Mandel's work indicates that Marxism is viewed as a universal theory and as a theory of universal history, within which the analysis of bourgeois society is merely an application of the, quote, general, end quote, methodology. Nowhere is this universalistic pretension so apparent as in the scope of Marxist economic theory, where, to name a few, Mandel indiscriminately strings together examples across centuries, from New Guinea to Siberia, from Mesopotamia to Morocco, Cyprus to the Ceylon, Samoa to Byzantium, all in order to discover the nature of something called the Marxist theory of society. Leaving aside till later sections Mandel's central affinities with Trotsky in the theory of organization and transition, two striking similarities should be observed before proceeding to the analysis of Mandel's relation to Marx. First, Mandel's writing is structured by contrived metaphor. As will be seen, his theory depends on metaphor, particularly in his arguments for long waves of capitalist development and for the hybrid, neither capitalist nor socialist nature of the USSR. More generally speaking, the entire range of Trotskyist metaphor burdens Mandel's texts. Instinct, eruption, molecular movement, images of disease and gynecology, introducing the medical experts of the Fourth International, and so on. Rarely is Mandel's use of metaphor convincing, and seldom is Mandel's use of metaphor conducive to literary persuasion. Mandel is an able rhetor. Yet, Mandel's general style of argument is never so persuasive as Trotsky's. A debater rather than an orator, Mandel is particularly heavy-handed with opponents in argument, and this is a second striking similarity with Trotsky, even though with Mandel it is lifted to new heights. That Mandel should espouse the orthodox bifurcation of knowledge into categories of, quote, proletarian and, quote, bourgeois science is perhaps little cause for surprise, but Mandel's criteria for discourse are more stringent yet. In one place, for example, Mandel disallows as, quote, eclectic, end quote, the form of argument which proceeds, quote, on the one hand, bracket class, end bracket, on the other, end quote. Following Trotsky, such uncertainty must, for Mandel, be understood as petty bourgeois vacillation or outright betrayal. In another significant case, the discursive morals of Stalinism are summoned by Mandel in order to dismiss the arguments of the class traders, Beilharz and Burnham. I think it's militant, Beilharz, and James Burnham. Oh, now I feel like a dumbass. Yeah, militant, Beilharz. Quote, these people have in effect crossed the class lines and joined the bourgeoisie, ... Nothing more needs to be said about this bracket new class, end bracket thesis, end quote. Dubious though Mandel was of Brunelleschi's analogous argument, Trotsky at least took it sufficiently serious to warrant reply, however inadequate that reply may have been. Indeed, it could be said that Trotsky was obliged to take such arguments seriously, as they represented legitimate extrapolations of tendencies in his own thought. With Mandel, in comparison, the polemical saber has lost whatever critical edge the polemical saber had in Trotsky's hand. Relieved of the contradiction appropriate to a differentiated world and hardened through constant repetition through changing times, Mandel's, quote, discursive, end quote, style marks the further consolidation of Trotskyism as an orthodoxy in its own right. This said, certain absences and presences might be expected in Mandel's relation to Marx's work. New section. Mandel's relation to Marx's work. Mandel takes Marx and Marxism to be intact, uncorrupted by internal contradiction, and untouched by the 20th century's tragedy of errors. For Mandel, the present proclamation on the Western left of the, quote, crisis of Marxism, end quote, lacks substantial roots and should be seen as a bourgeois conspiracy rather than as a practical representation of a radical malaise. Mandel sees himself alone as the true interpreter of Marx to the extent that he denies that his own work constitutes one interpretation of Marx among others. Mandel refuses outright the hermeneutic principle that the task of constructing truth or adequacy and understanding lies with the interpreter rather than the text. Mandel himself clearly constructs his own Marx. There are three texts which allow the critical examination of the relationship between Mandel and Marx: his study of Marx's own theoretical genesis, and his two major economic treatises, Marxist Economic Theory and Late Capitalism. Mandel's registration of the importance of recent debates is witnessed in the first work in his intervention in one of the earlier disputes over the question of the relationship between the work of the young and the later Marx. In the formation of the economic thought of Karl Marx, 1843 to Capital, Mandel argues a middle road. According to Mandel, the young Marx sheds his philosophical chrysalis in order to emerge as an economist. In this understanding, there could be no other course for Marx than fully to embrace the data, which Mandel takes to be the stuff of real Marxist science. Mandel reduces Marx's contribution to the discovery of the real meaning of the theory of surplus value. Worse yet, Mandel never comes to his subject matter, the formation of Marx's thought from 1843 to Capital. His analysis halts 10 years short of Capital, as though the contribution and theoretical system of Capital were somehow established in its, quote, research, end quote, for Mandel, quote, data, end quote. Capital for Mandel existed in Marx's brain already with the early solution of the problem of the Ricardian Malthusian population laws. Quote, once this preparatory work was accomplished, Capital, the book, was ready. All that remained was to write Capital, the book, end quote. Capital's writing nevertheless took another 10 years, a fact which Mandel cannot grasp, as he presumes Capital to step fully grown from the earlier drafts in the Grundrisse. Theory, too, is telescoped by permanent revolution. Mandel's own major economic works can be seen as attempts at rewriting Capital with the, quote, dialectical scaffolding, end quote, removed, substituting his own empirical understanding of science for Marx's Hegelian project. In Marxist economic theory, Mandel fails to constitute the object of his analysis, instead discussing everything under the sun. In the absence of a clearly defined theoretical object, Mandel is obliged to discuss universal history. Mandel traces the historical development of universal equivalents and the emergence of commodity production rather than unfolding their modern conceptual dimensions or determinants. I'm going to repeat that. In the absence of a clearly defined theoretical object, Mandel is obliged to discuss universal history. Mandel traces the historical development of universal equivalents and the emergence of commodity production, rather than unfolding their modern conceptual dimensions or determinants. Having arrived historically at capitalist production, Mandel offers the classical orthodox arguments in order to characterize it. For Mandel, capitalism distinguishes itself by the existence of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, realized in a cyclical manner, by the contradiction between the effective socialization of production and the private form of appropriation, the play on words, the implicit elision of the difference between, quote, socialization, end quote, and, quote, socialism, end quote, goes undeclared, by the anarchic planlessness of capitalist production, and by the presumed revolutionary proletarian telos, which transforms class struggle from the economic level onto the political level. This definition provides the framework into which there is accommodated a mass of empirical material which is taken as, quote, proof, end quote, of the validity of the position of orthodox Marxism. Mandel recognizes some of the limits of Marxist economic theory in the preface to the German edition of Late Capitalism, speaking particularly against its excessively descriptive and insufficiently theoretical nature. Having recognized the problem, however, Mandel does not go far in rectifying it. The structure of late capitalism resembles in general the structure of the 1857 plan for capital, rather than that eventually applied in capital itself, with the exception that, in ending, late capitalism mirrors the penultimate apocalyptic chapter of Capital. This latter dimension is perhaps late capitalism's only strong similarity to Capital Volume 1. It mimics the latter's worst thesis, the allegedly inevitable, quote, double negation, end quote, of proletarian revolution, following carefully executed considerations on analytical problems like the world market, the armaments industry, the service sector, and so on. Socialist revolution steps unexpectedly from the text. Quote, the final abolition of capitalist relations of production will be the central objective of the mass revolutionary movement of the international working class that is now approaching, end quote. Ernest Mandel. Mandel's variation on the Marxian double negation can itself be negated on no less than 4 grounds. The movement of which Mandel speaks is not a mass movement, is not revolutionary, not international, and its impending victory is not imminent. This can be said at least in the absence of a substantial argument to the contrary. The means by which Mandel claims to construct the argument which supports this structure and this structure's revolutionary issue does not differ radically from the method applied in Marxist economic theory, the book Marxist Economic Theory, not Marxist economic theory as such. In Marxist economic theory, the book, the structure of Capital, the book, Capital 1, is viewed as a historical, logical, and form. This has been refuted over and over again that this is what Marx is doing. It's a very, I find Beilharz, this is just me blowing smoke at someone else, but I find Beilharz like, and this is 1987, some of these things that he's saying are probably way more controversial in their time than they are now. But the idea of a historical logical sequence of capital, which is inherited from Engels, that interpretation of Capital Volume 1, is largely, if not definitively, refuted by the best scholars of Marx's critique of political economy. That historical logical form, as if it's describing a sequence from like a barter to a capitalist society in the most abstract form. It's no longer accepted. There's a piece on my channel called The Myth of Simple Commodity Production, which is about precisely this. It's by Christopher J. Arthur. In Late Capitalism, the book, Mandel reduced method to research, ascribing to Marx his own positivist method of research, quote, toing, end quote, and quote, froing, end quote, between empirical material, which is taken to be the starting point, and empirical material's lawful expression. Mandel proposes a, quote, 6-fold articulation of Marx's dialectical method, end quote. The 6 stages follow from fact gathering and analysis to the production of laws of motion, the establishment of the relationship between the whole and the parts, with empirical verification of the foregoing stages and, finally, renewed empirical and perhaps theoretical considerations concluding the process. Much of the controversy surrounding Mandel's work has arisen from his association of the practices of empirical science and Marxist theory. Mandel claims, for example, to prove theoretically the argument for the tendency of the rate of profit to fall due to the rise in the organic composition of capital, that is due ultimately to the increase in the proportion of the constant capital or technology to that of labor in the production process. As Robert Rawthorne has pointed out, however, in criticism of Mandel, or Bob Rawthorne, let's look him up, see if he's anybody that the internet can tell us something about. Bob Rawthorne. Bob Rawthorne is Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of Cambridge and has been elected as Life Fellow of King's College. He is also a Senior Research Fellow of the Center of Population Research at the Department of Social Policy and Intervention, University of Oxford. Below in this Wikipedia is in a picture. It's one of the most popular pictures of, it's definitely from the same event as like the most popular picture of Ernest Mandel. And it says it's from the Congress on Capitalism in the 70s at Tilburg, the Netherlands. And the people in the picture are Ernest Mandel, Herbert Gintis, Rob Rawthorne, Elmar Altvater, and organizer Theo van de Klundert. I'm embarrassed that I've never heard of this guy before, because seems kind of important. As Bob Rawthorne has pointed out, however, in criticism of Mandel, profit rates have fallen in recent years due to, quote, empirical rather than, quote, theoretical, end quote, factors. The so-called, quote, profit squeeze, end quote, has limited the share of surplus value going to industrial capital. Mandel, that is to say, attempts to establish an empirical argument by theoretical means. Like the state capitalists, he collapses different levels of abstraction appropriate to each form of argument. Another critic of Mandel, Athar Hussein, has argued, let's see who this is. I don't know. I'm not seeing anything for him, but I'm seeing a thing that's like an obituary for him from London School of Economics, but not seeing anything for him. Another critic of Mandel, Athar Hussein, has argued that Mandel is a self-verifying and self-congratulatory. Mandel's framework is a self-verifying and self-congratulatory framework. Anything that moves is taken by Mandel to prove his case. Further, the way in which Mandel conducts his empirical analysis undermines his justification for using Marxian categories. Mandel simply presumes that statistics, quote, translate, end quote, directly into Marxian discourse, but in the process of, for example, treating price as equivalent to value, Mandel collapses the basic Marxian distinction between essence and appearance, thereby jeopardizing his own orthodoxy. Mandel makes Marxian theory practically obsolete as an analytical device by working on the empirical level, then claiming to prove the dogmas of orthodoxy, Mandel's articles of faith beyond discussion, with empirical material which belongs to another discourse altogether. As Maddock, I'm sure if you're listening to this channel you know who Paul Maddock is, explains, however, data is simply not readily convertible into Marxian discourse, for Marx's is an abstract theory which by nature is ill-disposed purely to empirical verification. Marxists are always right, especially in political economy. The form of Mandel's argument undermines its raison d'etre as economics with a Marxian intention. It is not enough for Mandel to be a competent and original economist. Mandel must also be seen to be a revolutionary economist, on the basis that science is the fount of revolution. Here is the logic of Kautsky and Hilferding. Socialism is not only desirable but necessary, but the projection of modern economic science, with a Marxist twist, as revolutionary in effect, and of socialism as necessity, is self-delusion. Science is only what science is. Science can, quote, tell the truth, end quote, as best science can, but the most science can possibly achieve is competing representations of the world. The practice of politics, understood as the realm of social change, is another thing altogether. Even prior to a formal consideration of Mandel's treatment of the question of transition, a basic misconstruction can be anticipated. Transition could not be seriously theorized if transition is not taken as a political problem in transition's own right. The economically sophisticated Trotskyism of Ernest Mandel succeeds only in offering more elaborate reasons for its refusal to face this situation. Excuse me. New section. Transition. Mandel's analysis of Soviet-type societies. Mandel's Marxism in general and his thinking about transition in particular is like Trotsky's, bound up with the experience of the Russian Revolution. Mandel's treatment of transition in the East will be dealt with first here as a preliminary to the criticism of his proposals for a transition to socialism in the West. First, however, some methodological observations are in order. Mandel's writings on the problem of transition are marred by the application of an inappropriate level of generality. Transition in Mandel's usage usually refers to the transition between modes of production in universal history. The proper object of specific transition in this instance, the transition to a new form of social organization in the USSR, is deflected from the beginning onto a broader plane via the medium of the general theory of modes of production, which Mandel espouses. Quote, transition, end quote, functions in Mandel's work as an economic category residing, quote, between, end quote, modes of production. In, quote, in transition, end quote, comes to function in Mandel's usage as an equivalent to, quote, in limbo, end quote, a fact which militates against the construction of a precise definition of the nature of the USSR. Mandel constantly avoids analysis of the USSR as a specific case, deflecting discussion onto a quasi-typological plane concerning transitional societies, quote, in general, end quote, in accordance with the trans-historical scheme of, quote, historical materialism, end quote. Mandel's rhetorical advice that transitions take a long time, or that the USSR is neither here, capitalism, nor there, socialism, can be of little intellectual consolation, for as he himself admits, there can be little parallel in the experience of the transmission from slave to serf, to free labor and the transition to socialism, in which case the transhistorical discussion about transition is either obfuscation or else further proof of Mandel's universalistic pretenses. For when pressed to explain the specifics of Soviet transition, Mandel falls back onto common sense, quote, transitions take a long time, end quote. But Mandel is not uniformly evasive about the precise nature of the USSR. His general theory of history, taken from Trotsky after all, indicates that an either-or verdict must be delivered, capitalism or socialism. This is the only choice for industrial societies. Mandel is welded, as is Trotsky, to the institutional legacy of the Red October. Mandel is bound to present the course of Soviet history as an artificially prolonged aberration from its original or socialist reality and intention. Mandel's earlier diagnosis of the condition of the Soviet state comes directly from the pages of The Revolution Betrayed. The Soviet economy is seen as being marked by the contradictory combination of a non-capitalist mode of production and a basically bourgeois mode of distribution. Thereby it is transitional between capitalism and socialism, this condition explaining its residual use of capitalist economic categories. For Mandel, as for Trotsky, the contradiction between the Soviet mode of production and the Soviet mode of production's mode of distribution is to be explained by the continued existence of scarcity, that is, by insufficient productivity. Mandel ignores the development of Soviet productivity or productive forces, which has occurred over 60 years, and this latter without substantially transforming either production relations or distribution. Nothing has changed since the 30s for Mandel. Like Trotsky, Mandel follows Preobrazhensky in arguing, still decades later, that the transitional society is marked by the antagonistic coexistence of market and plan. Mandel's definition, therefore, suggests that the USSR is a combination of capitalist and socialist elements. When pressed, however, Mandel denies the existence of, quote, socialist elements, end quote, in the USSR. What might the USSR's nature then be? In more recent writings, Mandel introduces a new metaphor into the Trotskyist tradition, the argument that the USSR is a hybrid form of society. The modification is as follows, quote, The production relations specific to the transitional society are thus a hybrid combination of essentially non-capitalist economic planning and the elements of commodity production, with their drive towards private appropriation and private enrichment, which arise from the basically still bourgeois distribution relations. End quote. Mandel. Elsewhere, Mandel compounds metaphors, now adding an astronomical image in order to deal with the problem of how the regime reproduces itself. Quote, once launched into orbit, the structure remains in this orbit and can be directed from it only by social revolutions or counter-revolutions, by explosions or perturbations. End quote. The conclusion and increasing contestation of the Trotskyist definition of the USSR since Trotsky's death is evident in Mandel's attempts to discredit alternative theories while attempting to sustain Trotsky's with the, quote, hybrid, end quote, qualification. According to Mandel, the rejection of existing explanations that the USSR is either capitalist or socialist or else is the regime of a new class would necessitate the admission that, quote, we are dealing with the specific hybrid relations of production of a specific country or group of countries, end quote. Yet again, the fact that Mandel writes in a period of lively Marxist debate has had little effect on Mandel's basic premises, nor do Mandel's conclusions differ from Trotsky's notions of the, quote, hybrid, end quote, society notwithstanding. Mandel follows Trotsky's political line. For Mandel also, the USSR remains a workers' state which, like the corrupt trade union, nevertheless warrants defense, and adheres to Trotsky's strategic response, agreeing that a political revolution will provide the necessary corrective. In the analysis of other East European societies, Mandel follows through the necessitarian logic developed by Trotsky. Socialism can now be produced not only from above, but also across national boundaries. He develops a new metaphor to cover the discrepancy between the Soviet state and the Soviet state's progeny, where the USSR has become a degenerated worker state. The satellites are deformed. Though mutant, they maintained real socialist potential because of their paternal pedigree. Nationalized forms of property have been endowed upon them by the Soviet Union. Socialism here could not logically be regenerated, nor could the raison d'etre, or the raison d'etre, of the Fourth International any longer easily be defended. The old mole kept breaking through the surface in the wrong places, nowhere near the Trotskyist headquarters. What could Trotskyist leaders like Mandel do but applaud it? Like Trotsky, Mandel understands socialism as essentially a matter of planning or nationalization. Mandel views economic problems as the major problems of the transition to socialism. In the book, Marxist Economic Theory, the key problem of the transition period is determining the optimum growth rate. The hardest problem is to be solved during the period of transition from capitalism to socialism. The hardest problems to be solved during the period of transition from capitalism to socialism are those of agriculture and distribution. Since politics follows economics, economics must be given first priority. Mandel's attachment to socialism seems to spring from an interest in efficiency. In keeping with his methodology, his arguments lead logically to priorities which are quantitative rather than qualitative in nature, inclined to the logic of redistribution rather than to that of restructuring of social relations, and this holds true for East and West alike. Mandel argues also alienation results from scarcity rather than relations of domination, in Eastern Europe at least, and identifies bureaucratization with the continued existence of market and money relations rather than with the concentration of power in the party state. What overall judgment can be made of Mandel's position on transition in the East? His earlier formulation, duplicating Trotsky's, is entirely vulnerable to the foregoing criticism of Trotsky's own theory, with the qualification that whatever credibility Trotsky's analysis has in 1937, Mandel's repetition lacks decades later. Trotsky's own belief that the USSR was still in, quote, in transition, end quote, during his lifetime may be theoretically dubious, but is not lacking in personal justification or immediate plausibility. That Mandel can simply repeat Trotsky's analysis years later is altogether different. Mandel's justification for this repetition is the combined presupposition that nothing essential has changed, that the USSR must be, by definition, be transitional in the first place. He refuses the possibility that the USSR might be a permanent social order rather than a society, quote, in transition, end quote. Mandel does not substantiate his case with adequate empirical or logical evidence. All manner of arguments to the contrary are ignored. Only those like state capitalism are engaged because they can be theoretically pulverized. Mandel insists that the USSR, like all things in a dialectical world, must still be, quote, going, end quote, somewhere. It must be going somewhere. Else doubt is cast on the scheme of the general theory of modes of production, ending by fiat in capitalism, then socialism. And it must be going towards socialism, as it is a regime allegedly marked by the signs of socialism, in the fact of the regime's attachment to the principle. And it must be going towards socialism, as it is a regime allegedly marked by the signs of socialism, in the fact of its attachment to the principle of planning. Mandel's introduction of the notion of the, quote, hybrid, end quote, society must be seen as an ill-chosen revision, intended to close the debate over the question of the nature of the USSR by co-opting elements of the alternative explanations into his own. The result, the notion of hybrid society, is a contradictory and potentially explosive one. Mandel's choice of metaphor is particularly inept. That society which is hybrid cannot be heading towards socialism. Arbitrary crossbreeding cannot simply be, quote, undone, end quote, by specialists at a later date. The logic of the notion of the hybrid society suggests exactly that which Mandel rejects, that the USSR is a new being, a new society. The derivation of Mandel's metaphor is unclear. If it is vegetable, then the problem arises that the hybrid specimen is not easily propagated. If animal, it may refer to the mule, inelegant but practical, a beast capable of carrying the burden of capital H history. Mandel's hybrid society, in any case, cannot be undone, so it cannot possess the transitional telos which he ascribes to it. A transitional society is going somewhere. A hybrid society is here to stay, though it may well succeed in propagating itself in Eastern Europe on the point of a bayonet. Mandel's most recent qualification seems to suggest that the USSR is not so much a hybrid as a mutation. Even more than the hybrid notion does this argument suggest that Soviet-type society stands alone, sui generis. But this is exactly the argument which Trotskyism is constituted against, and precisely the logic which Trotskyism has so long resisted, for it violates the Trotskyist philosophy of history. As Hillel Tickton has argued, Mandel here is trapped within the definition and tradition of Trotskyism. Mandel is prevented from thinking his theoretical position through to its logical conclusion by the structural constraints imposed by the concepts of the Trotskyist tradition. Transition in the West. Mandel's theory of socialist revolution. Mandel views world revolution as an objective process which has dominated the recent history of the modern world. It is a process which has detoured through the Third World, the epicenter of world revolution passed from 1948 to 1968, from Western Europe to the East, implicitly returning to Western Europe with the May events in France and later activity in Italy. Revolution remains on the European agenda for Mandel, but has been rerouted. In the West, the situation is quite simply that the revolution has been betrayed, delayed by bad leadership. Yet in China and Yugoslavia, revolution triumphed despite bad Stalinist leaderships. The anomaly in such a judgment indicates the continuing tension in Trotskyism between objective and subjective views of the necessary conditions for socialist revolution. For Trotskyism simultaneously accepts the Leninist contention that socialism is the product of an organized vanguard at the head of a, quote, mass, end quote, movement, and endorses the older Marxist idea of the Second International, that socialism is written into the order of things and will out. This tension in Trotskyist thinking becomes particularly clear in Mandel's work enabling Mandel simultaneously to argue vanguardist and spontaneist strategies. For example, the Cuban Revolution, conducted in the absence of a Leninist party, is nevertheless deemed socialist, at least to the extent that the standard recipe for deformed worker states, political revolution, does not apply. Such inconsistencies do not bother Mandel, who changes feet as circumstance dictates. The situation in the West may be less immediately clear than it is in Cuba, but it is nevertheless favorable for Mandel, even in the extreme. The events of 1968 demonstrates that new, quote, detonators, end quote, like the student movement, can set off broader social explosions, but they can, of course, have real effectivity only if integrated into the workers' movement, or at least into its aspiring leadership. In the West, the subject of revolutionary change remains the working class, and its party, the Fourth International, the piston in search of some steam. Quote, spontaneous, end quote, revolutions, following the examples of Yugoslavia, China, and Cuba, do not seem to be on the agenda in the West. Mandel relieves Trotsky of his task of awaiting the American Labor Party. Mandel maintains a naive faith in the revolutionary capacity of the American working class, for the most powerful and numerically largest proletariat in the world cannot fail to perform eventually. Only then, finally, will the theory of world revolution be vindicated and the historic vocation of the Fourth International fulfilled, piston and mole united. Mandel's political thinking is derived directly from Trotsky's. Both maintain that the situation for revolution is rotten ripe. Some examples offered by Mandel as proof of this historic trend are even more fantastic than Trotsky's own projections. According to Mandel, conditions were being created in 1954 for a Trotskyist upsurge in the Soviet Union. Similarly, the demonstrations on the attempted assassination of Togliatti after the war provided for Mandel an instinctive posing of the question of power. More recently, Mandel has confessed that he and his friends seriously anticipated a German Revolution as the outcome of the Second World War. Such errors, which can presumably, like Trotsky's, be put down to bad timing, are extreme manifestations of Mandel's general perspective. It is Mandel's belief that all countries will follow the same road to socialism. It is his general prognosis that, quote, it is most unlikely that capitalism will survive another half-century, end quote. Ernest Mandel. The revolutionary telos is seeking a place to set itself. Until it comes home to the West, the epicenter of world revolution will shift as capital or reason dictates. Get some water. Get some water. How is Mandel's faith in this revolutionary telos sustained? Its primary condition of existence is the conflation of economic and political forms of class struggle. The direct association of these forms of struggle produces the proletarian telos, which breaks out sporadically until it finds its home in a situation characterized by a decayed regime and growing Trotskyist or Stalinist question mark, parenthesis, or Stalinist question mark, and parenthesis party. For Mandel, economic struggles grow into political struggles. The strength of his belief is vindicated in his endorsement of the Prussian minister von Puttkamer's enunciation that, quote, every strike contains the hydra of the revolution, end quote. Who is von Puttkamer? Von Puttkamer. Karl Jesko von Puttkamer, who lived from 1900 to 1981, was a German admiral who was naval adjutant to Adolf Hitler during World War II. Like Trotsky, but again with less justification decades later, Mandel cannot differentiate between industrial relations and socialist politics. For Mandel, the trigger of socialist consciousness is the collapse of capitalism. Social revolution is the outcome of economic crisis. Mandel brings to the tradition in Marxism, which takes the proletariat to be the historic bearers of socialism, those stand-ins may be accepted. The proletariat only needs its immediate consciousness shattered by capitalist crisis to break out of its present mold. The proletariat absorbs bourgeois ideology in its everyday existence, but is really revolutionary by disposition. The proletariat's real nature as the chosen class is beyond dispute. The proletariat's, quote, revolutionary mission, end quote, is inscribed by its, quote, objective roots, end quote. Capitalist society bipolarizes into minuscule bourgeoisie and homogeneous overwhelming proletariat. Mandel adheres to the Trotskyist tradition in determining the status of the proletariat without, or even despite, reference to its actual consciousness. Quote, late capitalism, end quote, is held to provide an excellent school for the proletariat, says Master Mandel, for though late capitalism integrates the class into late capitalism structures, late capitalism also breeds a working-class militancy. For Mandel, the spontaneous strivings of the proletariat emerge fully in a situation of crisis. Normal situations produce reformist consciousness. Crises produce revolutionary consciousness. These understandings of Mandel result from the combination of two maxims. That being determines consciousness, and that revolution is written into the order of things. Capitalist collapse, the objective determinant, forms the subjective political will, rupturing the normal relationship between being and consciousness. Social change occurs for Mandel, quote, first, quote, objectively, end quote, in society rather than in individuals. Socialism is achieved, quote, in reality, end quote, before socialism is in consciousness, as though socialism, the social order premised on the development of consciousness, could arrive unheralded, quote, behind the backs, end quote, of socialism subjects. I want to repeat that because that is very, very important. A very, very a very good sentence in my opinion. Social change occurs for Mandel, first, quote, objectively, end quote, in society rather than individuals. Socialism is achieved in, quote, reality, end quote, before socialism is achieved in consciousness, as though socialism, the social order premised on the development of consciousness, could arrive unheralded, quote, behind the backs, end quote, of socialism subjects. Within so implausible an argument, there is a familiar logic. In arguing that individuals can improve only after individuals have experienced abundance at the hands of a benevolent society. Mandel reveals the logic of Jacobinism basic to his thought. If politics in the new society does not consist of the practice of the sum of its willing participants confronting social problems, then it must be the domain of benevolent despots who act on their behalf. Mandel's image of social revolution continues the tradition of Bolshevism, where the party leads the masses to overthrow the bourgeois state in order to inaugurate the, quote, new, end quote, society for the good of the people. Mandel's theory of socialist revolution is an articulated variant of Marx's 1859 preface, where the forces/relations formula functions as objective component, the source and determinant of social change, and the Leninist party functions as subjective component. The maturity of objective conditions is seen as prior to the subjective moment. The latter is nevertheless held to be indispensable. The subject, the proletariat, is reduced to the party. Quote, the Leninist theory of organization constitutes the Marxist science of the subjective factor, end quote. The 1859 preface provides the objective basis of the subjective possibility of socialism. The, quote, incompletion, end quote, of Marx's 1859 preface warrants the introduction of an external factor, the Leninist party, which crowns the work of the endogenous factor, the productive forces, yet it is only endogenous necessity which makes this intervention possible. This is true to the extent that Mandel allows for cases in which socialism is the product of such forces alone, even in the absence of a healthy Bolshevik party. Yet Mandel simultaneously holds that the absence of revolutionary victories in the West is the result of the crisis in the quote, subjective factor, end quote, that is, in proletarian leadership. Mandel's theory of revolution is therefore not only a revision of the 1859 preface, but is also a reworking of the transitional program by Trotsky, where objective conditions are understood to be ripe, but explained more systematically with reference to economic cycles and crises, and where the, quote, subjective factor, end quote, parenthesis, and the Fourth International, end parenthesis, still lags behind. As in Trotsky, so in Mandel, does this argument pertain less directly to specific individual nation-states than to a world process of socialist revolution, which is held to be unfolding, subject to uneven development and delays brought about by treacherous leadership. Mandel is nothing if not an internationalist. Mandel's international commitment to socialist revolution and to the Fourth International are constructed at a high level of abstraction, again eschewing specificity. The slogan of Mandel's political agitation are abstract and rhetorical, according to Mandel. The only legitimate orientation for socialist politics today is towards the socialist United States of Europe. The sequence of logic is clear. International revolution, the necessary response to the internationalization of capital, necessitates international organization. Mandel defends the principle and the practice of a, quote, single center, end quote, of world revolution. Mandel's argument that the world concentration of revolutionary initiative is necessary in order to deal with centralized capital recalls the arguments of the early Comintern. He argues, like Trotsky after 1933, that such problems as emerge in the international are circumstantial, rather than imminent to the idea of a centralized international. Significantly, Trotsky and Mandel alike see the construction of the international as the solution to the problems faced by socialists. Their common premise is that organizational responses can solve cultural problems, that an organized international can negate the cultural absorption of the popular masses into bourgeois society. In keeping with his notion that the world system is more than the sum of the world system's parts, Mandel invests the international with a mystique, suggesting that the international, the Fourth International, is somehow more than the sum of the Fourth International's parts, the National Trotskyist parties. Mandel's loyalty to the Fourth International is therefore to be understood as loyalty to the idea of an international. This abstract organizational loyalty corresponds with Mandel's refusal of the priority of national specificities, serving further to elide even his own principles and commitments. This level of misplaced abstraction, so common to Mandel, is also evident in his more directly political thinking, which is always, quote, utopian, end quote, to some degree, in that it typically presumes the achievement or establishment of the state of affairs under discussion. Mandel usually argues as though he has already arrived at some transitional point, thence moving the focus onto the consolidation and extension of gains which are presumed to have been made. In one place, for example, Mandel slips from a tactical argument about revolution into the presumption of the actual existence of dual power, moving on to considerations of the extension of his non-existent dual power in situations and of the extension of this non-existent dual power situation into socialism. Mandel proceeds to explain not how socialism arises, but how socialism can be protected, avoiding always the problem of socialism's beginnings. A more spectacular example of Mandel's ethereal politics can be found in Mandel's proposed solution to the contradictory problem, how to increase both accumulation and consumption in the transition period. Mandel proposes as solution that arms expenditure be transferred to socially useful needs, an eminently sensible suggestion, but a suggestion which is totally impracticable in the absence of a separate demonstration as to how the world might arrive at a situation which would allow such a project of social engineering. Even Mandel's more immediate proposals posit the existence of that which is yet to be achieved. He issues assurances that the workers' state will be more democratic than the bourgeois state, will eliminate careerism, and guarantees that the Soviet democracy will be exercised by workers and poor peasants. Regardless of chronology and projection, Mandel's claims are based on nothing more than assurance, yet are presented as necessity. Two levels or types of utopia can be discerned in Mandel's work. a more immediate variant approximating the, quote, government of Soviets, end quote, and a more abstract variant reminiscent of Trotsky's image in Literature and Revolution, the book Literature and Revolution. Mandel's immediate, quote, utopia, end quote, is in a specific sense no less utopian than his advanced variant, for its precondition is a regime of direct democracy. Mandel refuses absolutely the legitimacy of representative government to the extent that Mandel reduces the question of the status of parliamentary forms in the transition to socialism to the level of tactics rather than theory. According to Mandel, the citizen in a regime of representative democracy, quote, is neither a protagonist nor even an actor in the political drama. The citizen in a regime of representative democracy can only have a walk-on part as a spear carrier, end quote. The theatrical image is eye-catching, but misses the point. Everyday politics is not an epic in bourgeois society. Mandel's image of the new society is one dear to the Trotskyist tradition, and best expressed in works like those of C.L.R. James. It is a composite of Athens in the early days of the Russian Revolution, the regime of associated producers where cooks govern, using recipes from Mandel's cookshop. Beyond the realm of direct democracy lies another image of the future, which immediately brings to mind Trotsky's rationalist fantasies in the book Literature and Revolution. The resemblances are almost complete. Mandel anticipates in socialism the achievement of a situation of social transparency, in which all men master all social relations and all develop scientific aptitudes, as, quote, nothing now stands in the way of progressively transforming all men into scientists and scholars, end quote. Presumably all women will still be doing the washing up. Unlike Lafargue's socialist hedonists, the citizens of Mandel's utopia need leisure to work, to pursue science and politics. For mankind's first task is not responding to local or national needs, but in working out a Faustian agenda, a plan of economic development encompassing the irrigation of the Sahara and the transformation of the Amazonian jungle. Quote, humanity will master its geographical surroundings, the configuration of the globe, the climate and the distribution of great water reserves, at the same time preserving or restoring ecological equilibrium. It will overturn everything down to its own biological foundations, end quote. Mandel. The scenario is Trotsky's or Goethe's with an added twinge of ecological conscience. Mandel's spare carriers, the ordinary citizens of East and West, would very likely have difficulty raising enthusiasm for such a project. There is also a more practical dimension to Mandel's political proposals. Practical politics does not enter in Mandel's proposals concerning the transitional program. If neither of Mandel's, quote, utopian, end quote, proposals have much bearing on reality, then what are the effects of his transitional proposals? Much of Mandel's earlier notoriety on the revolutionary left springs from his interpretation of the transitional program with its proposal for structural reforms, for, quote, structural reforms, end quote. In the early formulations, spear carriers can become titans through the pursuit of such reforms. The main purpose of the strategy of structural reforms, quote, is to effect an integration between the immediate aims of the masses and the objectives of the struggle which effectively challenge the very existence of the capitalist system itself, end quote. Understood as an alternative to the mere juxtaposition of minimum and maximum programs, quote, structural reforms, end quote, are thrown up which objectively challenge the operation of capital. In function, therefore, quote, structural reforms, end quote, seem to be identical to the program of transition drawn up by Trotsky. In a more recent argument, however, Mandel presents the demands of the transitional program, the shorter working week, sliding scale of wages, and so on, as defensive in character, and therefore preliminary to the transition to socialism proper. According to Mandel, this defensive program must be integrated into the overall anti-capitalist struggle of, quote, transitional demands, end quote, including nationalization, workers' control, popular committees, and a people's militia. In this later definition, Mandel seems to be calling Trotsky's transitional program nothing more than a defensive strategy, reserving the label, quote, transition proper, end quote, for the elementary phases of the revolutionary process, the overthrow of the state. No explanation is given as to how defensive trade union struggles might grow into anti-capitalist transitional struggles. No such explanatory obligation falls on Mandel's shoulders, for Mandel believes political class struggle is to be the natural outgrowth of economic class struggle. To explain here is nothing, to assert is everything. One second. Mandel probably introduces these later qualifications into the argument in order to rectify a situation which allows his proposals for transition to be cast as, quote, reformist, end quote. Indeed, Mandel's earlier calls for structural reforms bear a close resemblance to the arguments of his besworn enemies, the Eurocommunists. The fundamental goal of structural reforms is to take away the levers of command in the economy from the financial groups, trust and monopolies, and place them in the hands of the nation to expand the public sector and workers' control. Here Mandel is caught in a polemical trap. Burdened by unrealizable utopias, Mandel must specify a practical political program. But Mandel's economic catastrophism and rationalism militate against the consideration of practical political programs. Mandel argues that to work in and against bourgeois society is impossible without integration. What policies might then be pursued by revolutionaries living in bourgeois societies? Mandel concedes that quote, revolutionary vocational space, end quote, organized radical work by teachers, doctors, and others can be of some positive effect, provided, of course, that such activity is subsumed organizationally to the Fourth International. Mandel refuses the argument that socialism, if at all possible, could only be the work of consciously organized alliances and movements. Mandel rejects social movements. The basis of his position is a kind of political ontology of labor. He argues that social movements can only fill vacuums which are created by the defeats of the labor movement to fulfill its historic tasks. Mandel cannot therefore allow detailed attention to the politics of contestation. Revolutionary posturing and theoretical guarantees prevent Mandel from taking new political forms into earnest consideration. These forms and their theoretical implications simply do not register on the grid of the orthodox. Leaving behind his earlier arguments for structural reforms, refusing other attempts to bridge the present and future, Mandel's politics seem, therefore, to cleave precisely into the bifurcation of minimum and maximum programs, the only, quote, bridge, end quote, being provided by revolutionary class telos. Mandel's politics, therefore, reflect those of the heritage which he seeks to renounce. That such a bifurcation should be the outcome of Mandel's theory comes as no surprise. It is already visible in the revolutionary stand of Trotskyism. The revolution will continue to be delayed, but the revolution can still be nurtured. In the meantime, such empirical or defensive struggles as are thrown up and deemed sound must be guarded. Mandel's Trotskyism is, as Sartre put it years ago, after all, a, quote, waiting art, end quote. Mandel is obliged by the tradition within which he works to limit the potential in contestatory struggles or issue movements as they relate to both state and economy. Mandel's strategic response to the state is no more sensitive than his one-dimensional view of economic struggles. If the state is nothing but the tool of the ruling class, the state can belong either to the bourgeoisie or to the proletariat. If the state belongs to the bourgeoisie, the state can only be seized or overthrown all at once, in one decisive act, as it is monolithic and lacking contradiction. It cannot be the site of contesting groups and interests, but only as the exclusive spoils of the ruling class. In economy, it is also a case of, quote, all or nothing, end quote. Mandel allows the demand for workers' control as a place in the program of structural reforms, but no more. Self-management can come only after the revolution, after the seizure of power. This state must be overthrown before self-management can be contemplated. Everything must be challenged all at once, or it will not be changed. Everything must be changed all at once, or it will not be changed at all, unless it is changed by Stalinists or petty bourgeois adventurers when the criteria are modified. These arguments place Mandel squarely in the Bolshevik tradition and in the Bolshevik lineage of Trotskyism, marking him off clearly from the later Pablo and other, quote, radical Trotskyists, end quote, who stressed that practical change, however humble, is possible now. However qualified Mandel's position may be in relation to both his own heritage and his own earlier positions, the overall logic of his Marxism is traditional rather than radical in nature, and imaginary rather than practical in disposition. Mandel's fundamental commitment is to the inevitability of revolution, and the guarantees of world history serve to prevent Mandel from undertaking a serious contemplation of transition or practical politics, for such a consideration must begin taking issues and people as they are and not as they ought to be. Mandel fails therefore not only to address problems of transition, but also avoids facing the present conjuncture. As Hussein points out, with a specific reference to the British case, Mandel's proposal of a transitional recipe combining Soviets and nationalization could not be less appropriate, given that parliamentary forms remain hegemonic and nationalization discredited in England. But if it is the conceptual structure and limits of his tradition which establish Mandel's politics, But if this is the conceptual structure and limits of his tradition which establish Mandel's politics and prevent Mandel's advance onto the terrain of contemporary struggles, Mandel's can hardly be viewed as a simple case of simple Bolshevism. Mandel's revolutionary telos is of a special and original kind, being theorized to a high degree of sophistication in his own technological variant of the 1859 preface. Mandel's theory of technological revolutions and long waves is the culmination of his intellectual project and provides the structure which ultimately encompasses and supports his revolutionary politics. It is here that this criticism of Mandel must conclude. New section: Mandel's theory of technological revolution and long waves. Come on, you piece of crap. Mandel first fully articulated his argument about technological revolutions and long waves in late capitalism, revising his position in certain respects in long waves of capitalist development, the Marxist interpretation. Mandel's images, if provocative, are also problematical. The combined metaphor of waves and revolutions simultaneously suggests movement of repetition and breakthrough. The synthesis of the two images might be taken to imply a repetitive but spiral motion in economy, or else to suggest that revolutions occur as waves, cyclically and automatically. Two main difficulties emerge here. First, the precise relationship between the schema of waves and that of revolutions is unclear. If waves predominate, then a repetitious and anti-revolutionary philosophy of history is suggested. Boom followed by crash ad nauseum. If, on the other hand, revolution or rupture is dominant, what becomes of the cyclical trends of the economy? Second, it should be observed that the nomenclature, in both its metaphorical derivations, contradicts the Trotskyist program, denying the scheme of prolonged decay outlined in the transitional program. At the root of the metaphorical confusion lies the tension in Mandel's work between science and revolution. Mandel's argument is compromised by the contradiction between accurate economic analysis and his desire to see the revolutionary telos vindicated. Either economic cycles reproduce capitalism, or economic cycles do not reproduce capitalism. For Mandel, the revolutionary scientist, economic cycles must both reproduce capitalism and not reproduce capitalism. Mandel details his scheme of long waves in late capitalism, the book. His argument is that in the history of international capitalism, cyclical movements of 7 or 10 years' duration exist within longer spans of approximately 50 years, of which there have so far been 4, characterized respectively by handicraft-made or manufacture-made steam engines, machine-made steam engines, electric and combustion engines, and by electronic apparatuses and the gradual introduction of nuclear energy. Ours is the long wave of the third technological revolution. According to Mandel, each long wave can be divided into two parts: an initial phase of application and subsequent accelerated accumulation, followed by a phase of generalization, bringing with it a tendency to gradually decelerating accumulation as technology is cheapened and loses that technology's, quote, revolutionary, end quote, effect. According to the general contours of the scheme, quote, we should today have entered into the second phase of the, quote, long wave, end quote, which began with the Second World War, characterized by decelerated capital accumulation, end quote. Ernest Mandel. The rapid succession of recessions in the central imperialist countries is taken to confirm this hypothesis. Mandel's scheme of periodization is the basis for his choice of the term, quote, late capitalism, end quote, to describe the present epoch. As the title of its French edition, Le Troisième Âge du Capitalisme, suggests, late capitalism is the third and final stage of capitalism. Late capitalism followed classical capitalism analyzed by Marx and imperialism analyzed by Lenin, and late capitalism is also the third stage of the technological revolution, the stage of capitalism corresponding with automation, capitalism's highest pre-terminal development. It is Mandel's argument about the decelerated phase of accumulation characteristic of the present epoch which is significant here, as it raises the question of revolution and the revolutionary status of the factor of technology, both as regards the general theory itself and as regards the nature of the present epoch. Critical attention must be focused on the character of the motor force which drives technological revolutions forward. The central question can be posed as follows: are technological revolutions and their accompanying long waves endogenous or exogenous in origin? This question immediately raises another, that of the status of Mandel's forced combination of the views of Trotsky and Kondratiev. I just want to look up Kondratiev. And the Kondratiev wave, which is important here. So Nikolai Kondratiev, who lived from 1892 to 1938, was a Russian-Soviet economist and proponent of the new economic policy, best known for the business cycle theory known as Kondratiev waves. Kondratiev became an early leading figure of Soviet economics and promoted the new economic policy system of small private free market enterprises in the Soviet Union. Kondratiev's theory that Western capitalist economies have long-term 50 to 60-year cycles of boom followed by depression gained recognition inside and outside the Soviet Union. Kondratiev was condemned and imprisoned in 1930 but continued to work until his execution during the Great Purge in 1938. Some of his work was published for the first time posthumously. And the Kondratiev wave. In economics, Kondratiev waves, also called supercycles, great surges, long waves, K-waves, or long economic cycles, are hypothesized cycle-like phenomenon in the modern world economy. The phenomenon is closely connected with technology life cycle. It is stated that the period of wave ranges from 40 to 60 years. The cycles consist of alternating intervals of high sectoral growth and intervals of relatively slow growth. Long-wave theory is not accepted by most academic economists. Among economists who accept it, there is a lack of agreement about both the cause of the waves and the start and end years of particular waves. Among critics of the theory, the consensus is that it involves recognizing patterns that may not exist. Back to the text. This question immediately raises another, that of the status of Mandel's forced combination of the views of Trotsky and Kondratiev. Against both logical and historical arguments, Mandel insists that the theory of long waves is Marxist in parentage. Mandel combines the incompatible in order to form the basis of his theory. Trotsky's theory was constructed against Kondratiev's primarily because Kondratiev took change to be endogenous in origin. More than this, Trotsky denied even the idea of the comparison of short 10 or 7-year cycles with, quote, long, end quote, cycles. Kondratiev's theory had, for Trotsky, to be seen for what Kondratiev's theory was, not a theory of change, but one of equilibrium. As Richard Day has it, Mandel agrees with both Kondratiev and Trotsky at the same time, quote, something which is logically impossible, end quote. Mandel's procedure, contrasting the views of Kondratiev and Trotsky, only to retain the logic of the former in tandem with claims of political fidelity to the latter, is completely unconvincing. Despite claims to pluralist explanation, Mandel privileges the explanatory and historical power of waves driven by technology. But if technology is the motor of history, what then becomes of human agency, or in Marxist terminology, what becomes of the class struggle? Having, quote, forgotten the class struggle, end quote, in Late Capitalism, the book, Mandel later introduces the notion of long waves of class struggle, which correspond to long waves in economic growth. Mandel fails completely to specify the basis of construction for this more political cycle in statistical, historical, or theoretical terms. The long wave of class struggle seems to be nothing more than assurance presented in diagrammatic form. The wave of class struggle functions as an effect of the long wave of development itself, as is indicated in Mandel's claim that class struggle, quote, intensifies, end quote, with the depressive period of the long wave. There is, however, a considerable shift in the arguments involved. Mandel attempts to throw focus back onto the political within the confines of the 1859 preface scheme, suggesting that social development is not automatic but contingent on the class struggle. He wishes to argue that the cause of the downturn is endogenous, whereas upturn, being contingent, is not endogenous. Mandel's determinism is accentuated by each attempt at its public denial. Mandel's recent arguments about, quote, relative autonomy, end quote, do little to improve the case, as the, quote, relativity, end quote, given with one hand is constantly retrieved dialectically by the other. The overall logic of Mandel's theory remains unaltered. If qualified and more closely specified, technology remains the prime mover of social change, and automation remains the great force of socialism. There are no substantial differences between the scheme in late capitalism and that in long waves. Technological change in the later version is still endogenous, but exogenously triggered, externally detonated. The argument of late capitalism is likewise based on the principle of endogenous development with external triggering mechanisms. The argument that the internal causation of long waves by technology is internally triggered by wars and revolutions functions as a theoretical, quote, last instance, end quote, of determination, while practically politics and history are reduced to economic and technological after effects, or fuses. Mandel's afterthought 6 years after the first publication of the book Late Capitalism, that class struggle rather than technology determines the course of history, is too little, too late. Mandel's afterthought that class struggle rather than technology determines the course of history serves only to shift emphasis within Mandel's modified 1859 scheme. Either politics or economics is determinant, as circumstances require. This is exactly the ambiguity which is the hallmark of orthodox Marxism. Orthodox Marxism is always correct because it cannot be proven wrong. Either the economic or political factor can always be blamed for the non-event of social revolution. Whatever the situation, whatever the outcome, all defeats and, quote, victories, end quote, can be explained within the existing paradigm. By this means, Trotskyism maintains its claim always to be correct, no matter how frequently Trotskyism is refuted by history or by criticism. Final section. Conclusions. Mandel and the Technological Road to Socialism. Ernest Mandel's economic interest and background served to add a novel dimension to contemporary Trotskyism. Retaining from Trotsky basic philosophical principles as well as notions of impending collapse and organization, Mandel's view of socialist transition is qualified by an intense faith in technology and automation. In this regard, and more emphatically than Trotsky, he is a, quote, Department 1, end quote, Marxist. It's a really good term. Awaiting for the results of the self-development of the productive forces. Mandel modifies Lenin, defining socialism as Soviets plus automation in television, the latter to be used as an instrument of direct democracy rather than privatized, quote, leisure, end quote. Automation takes on a central role in Mandel's Marxism, and one which is all the more perplexing given his stated opinion on technology. Against Mandel's dedication to technology as the prime mover of history can be placed his professed position, quote, belief, this is in italics, belief in the omnipotence of technology is the specific form of bourgeois ideology in late capitalism. And I'm going to repeat that. Belief in the omnipotence of technology is the specific form of bourgeois ideology in state capitalism. That was italicized. The rest is in italicized. So still a quote from Mandel. All bourgeois and many self-styled Marxist theorists of the omnipotence of technology elevate technology into a mechanism completely independent of all human objectives and decisions, which proceeds independently of class structure and class rule in the automatic manner of a natural law, end quote. Ernest Mandel. Into which category would Mandel fall were we to apply his own terms of criticism to the theory of long waves and technological revolutions? Mandel accepts the proposition that automation and capitalism must reach a point of incompatibility, thus implying that the complete fulfillment of the third technological revolution is identical with the advent of socialism. The alternative, socialism or barbarism, resolves itself, for those who operate with this technological vista, into a choice between socialist automation and capitalist decay. In its most emphatic formulation, it is Mandel's position that, quote, all the historical conditions of capitalism are concentrated in the twofold character of automation, end quote. Automation presents simultaneously the threat of destruction and the impossibility of emancipation. Within his own variation of the 1859 preface, socialism presents itself as the fulfillment of history, understood as the progress of technique. With specific reference to the nature of capitalist society, Mandel's arguments reflect the least satisfactory dimension of the Grundrisse, the Grundrisse's tendency to discuss socialism as end and as process in a determinist manner. Certainly Mandel endorses the Grundrisse's technological utopia, if in combination with elements of the image of the regime of associated producers in the third volume of Capital. More fundamentally, Mandel is committed to the notion in the Grundrisse that capital is immanently self-expansive, that capital is an ambiguous power which, in striving for both self-emancipation and self-preservation, inevitably brings itself to the point of self-destruction. The logic at work here is analogous to that in Mandel's theory as such. Despite class struggle, whether in its cyclical or immediate form, the implication is that capital somehow revolutionizes itself. In his limited analyses of capitalism and his more extended interest in history as the unfolding of technological progress through successive modes of production, Mandel's Marxism advances a, quote, automatic, end quote, view of history, which forecloses the discussion of problems of social change. It has been argued in this chapter that following and modifying Trotsky, Mandel's theory of history forecloses even on the possibility of a close scrutiny of the specific political or cultural situations or formations which arise in the 20th century. This foreclosure is no mere deficit or absence, and is more emphatically true of Mandel than of Trotsky, for Mandel produces even stronger arguments than Trotsky for the certainty of socialism, and this in an age where its likelihood seems even more remote. Indeed, it may even be the case that Mandel's arguments herald not progress but reaction. Mandel fails to understand the complications thrown up for transition by the technological theory of history. The short-term replacement of labor by machines serves not to introduce socialism, but rather to prolong the crisis, increasing unemployment and extending low-paid work. Automation here is the harbinger not of socialism, but of increased capitalist wealth and extended working-class poverty. Mandel's, quote, scientific, end quote, analyses and his, quote, revolutionary, end quote, predictions do not mesh. For all his, quote, revolutionary, end quote, professions, Mandel's, quote, scientific, end quote, theory has more in common with the theory of capitalist equilibrium than it has with Trotsky and the, quote, revolutionary, end quote, tradition. Hussein's charge that Mandel's, quote, science, end quote, is an exercise in astrology stands perhaps in need of modification, it can also be usefully viewed as an exercise in astronomy. Those who deal with the circular movements of bodies, whether celestial or terrestrial, can after all only observe and not influence their movements. The notions of fate and prediction remain central to Mandel's cosmological constellation. Mandel's attempts to combine science and revolution are bound to fail, for capitalism cannot simultaneously reproduce capitalism's self in theory and transform itself into socialism in rhetoric. The work of Mandel, this most innovative of Trotskyists, founders on the rocks of its claims to be simultaneously, quote, scientific, end quote, in Mandel's specific sense, end quote, revolutionary, end quote, in accordance with Trotsky's transition, in accordance with the Trotskyist tradition. The theoretical revolutionism of Mandel's science serves to undermine both its scientific and its political credibility. Striving after the identity of revolution and science, it ends in denying both. Presuming social transition to be already underway, it serves only to work against its possibility. That's the end of the chapter. Now I'm going to read the notes. See if there's anything in there that's worth reading. I'll read some of the citations, hopefully not repeating any. Here we go. So, in note 1 cites Mandel's Trotsky, published by New Left Books, which would be Verso Books at this time. Verso Books, or Verso Books today. And Mandel's From Stalinism to Eurocommunism, The Bitter Fruits of Socialism in One Country, also from New Left Books, where quotations from Trotsky suffice to both dispatch the opponent and close the case. Like I said in the past, the New Left Review, or in the New Left Books, and Verso, are infinitely, I would say, of the more conservative side of Trotskyism in terms of its origins, right? So, Tariq Ali, Ernest Mandel, Perry Anderson, and folks like that would be way more in alignment with orthodox Trotskyism than, say, I don't know, people in the line of like New Politics, the journal, or even the International Socialist, whose lineage is that of Tony Cliff. Let me see real quick if Tony Cliff has anything by Verso. Yeah, it doesn't seem like there's anything by Cliff. I mean, it's not to say that, like, it's like New Left Review has a politics, of course. It's not always clear, it doesn't always necessarily manifest itself in the same ways, and, like, New Left Review, like Monthly Review, or Verso Books, like Monthly Review Press, release a lot of different stuffs, but I think but their core is usually some kind of, they do have like a political tendency within them. As open as they try to be, and often are. So, Mandel on bureaucracy, a Marxist analysis. A Mandel essay called The Leninist Theory of Organization, which is in Robert Blackburn's edited volume, Revolution and Class Struggle, A Reader in Marxist Politics. We have Mandel, The Causes of Alienation, in Mandel and George Novak's edited volume, The Marxist Theory of Alienation, published by Pathfinder, again, Orthodox Trotskyist Press. Mandel, Introduction to Marxist Capital, Volume 3. If I didn't say this already, Mandel wrote the introductions to all the Penguin editions of Capital. Mandel piece, Workers Under Neo-Capitalism, in Mandel and Novak, The Revolutionary Potential of the Working Class, put out by Pathfinder. Mandel on bureaucracy. Mandel, Marxist Economic Theory. Mandel, Introduction to Marxism, published in 1979. Mandel's Introduction to Capital, Volume 1, Penguin, 1976. Mandel, Late Capitalism, 1975, New Left Books. Mandel, The Second Slump, a Marxist analysis of the recession in the 70s. Mandel, Introduction to Marxism. Mandel, Marxist economic theory. Sorry, I'm rereading a lot of the same things. Mandel, Report on the World Political Situation, 1979, World Congress of the Fourth International, Major Resolutions and Reports, put out by Intercontinental Press, New York, 1980. And Beilharz says, I don't know what this is in reference to, it says, it was this attitude which prompted M. Michael Kidron's criticism of Marxist economic theory as, quote, Maginot Marxism. What the hell does Maginot mean? In Kidron, Capitalism and Theory. I don't know. Mandel's piece, The Inconsistencies of State Capitalism, which I suppose will be a critique of people like Tony Cliff. Mandel, The Formation of the Economic Thought of Karl Marx, put out by Monthly Review. Like I said, Monthly Review isn't like a Trotskyist group, but it puts out things. It'll put out things by Trotskyists. B. Rowthorne, we talked about him earlier. This piece, Late Capitalism and New Left Review. A. Hussein, I can't remember his first name, so sorry. Crisis and Tendencies of Capitalism, that's from Economy and Society. Paul Maddock has a review of Ernest Mandel's Late Capitalism. I'd like to read that. On the Nature of the Soviet State from New Left Review. I'm assuming that's from Mandel. Doesn't say, it just says the name. Mandel, Revolutionary Marxism Today, New Left Books, 1979. Mandel, Marxist Economic Theory. Mandel, once again on the Trotskyist definition of the social nature of the Soviet Union. That's in Critique, which was the journal, or still is the journal. I don't know if Hillel Tickton still edits it, but there's a lot of good pieces in there. Also, the piece by Mandel, The Nature of the USSR, Socialism and Democracy, located in Procure, 18. 10 Theses on the Social and Economic Laws Governing the Society Transitional Between Capitalism and Socialism. On the Nature of the Soviet State, Beilharz says, elsewhere, Mandel summons more familiar images, explaining the Soviet bureaucracy as a parasitic cancer on the proletarian body. See his exchange with Paul Sweezy, Monthly Review, 31. Mandel on Nature, 10 Theses. Mandel, The Rise and Decline of Stalinism. That's in The Development and Disintegration of World Stalinism. That's put out by the American Socialist Workers' Party Education Series, New York, 1970. 50 Years of World Revolution, 1969. Hillel Tickton, The Ambiguities of Ernest Mandel, Critique number 12. Mandel, The New Vanguard, in Tariq Ali's book, The New Revolutionaries, Left Opposition, published by Peter Owen in London, 1969. And see Mandel's The Revolutionary Student Movement, Theory and Practice, and The Changing Role of the Bourgeois University. Mandel, Revolutionary Marxism Today, The Rise and Decline of Stalinism, Mandel, The Second Slump, Mandel, Workers' Control and Workers' Councils, published in International. Footnote, Beilharz says, I don't know what this is in reference to, this tendency is especially evident in Mandel's construction of a graph of the, quote, long cycle of class struggle, end quote, without any reference to political determinants. See Long Waves of Capitalist Development, The Marxist Interpretation by Mandel, 1980. Workers Under Neo-Capitalism, Economics in I think it's David McClellan's edited volume, Marx, The First 100 Years. Mandel, Revolutionary Strategies in the Imperialist Countries. I guess is Althusser, Collège, Marx in Jean-Marie Vincent et al. Kanta, Althusser, published in Paris, 1979. Jean-Marie Vincent, I think, is one of the people who's kind of similar to... I want to say he's kind of... I mean, I'm not exactly sure, but I think he's kind of similar to like the Crisis and Exit people, like Robert Kurtz and, Norbert Trinkel and Rose Vita something, and what was the other guy's name? God, I can't think of his name. But like people like that, Anselm Yappa, like you think he's like kind of like one of the bigger like Frankfurt School people in France. If you didn't know. Letter to George Brightman from Ernest Mandel from 1953, and Cliff Slaughter's book Trotskyism versus Revisionism, a documentary history, published by New Park in London, 1974. Volume 2, The Split in the International, and a letter from Brightman to Mandel, 14th of January, 1954. Ernest Mandel, A Socialist Strategy for Western Europe, Institute for Workers' Control, pamphlet number 10, Nottingham. Mandel, The Second Slump, Mandel, An Introduction to Marxist Economic Theory, Mandel, Late Capitalism, Social Democracy and Social Movements, Thesis 11. I'm not sure, is that him? Jean-Paul Sartre, The Communist in Peace, 1969. Hussein, Symptomology of Revolution in Economy and Society. There's a footnote, or there's a note that says, by Beilharz saying, we leave aside here other grounds of criticism. It has been argued by one critic, for example, that Mandel's theory cannot be sustained theoretically or empirically. See A. Kleinknecht, Innovation, Accumulation, and Crisis, Long Waves in Economic Development, ? Something by Richard Day in reference to long waves. Mandel, Self-Management, Dangers and Possibilities, published in International, 1975. Mandel, Late Capitalism. Hussein, Symptomology of Revolution. Okay, so that's the end of the notes. So thanks for listening. And for me, I mean, this doesn't make any difference to any of you, but for me, this is the last chapter from Trotsky, Trotskyism, and the Transition to Socialism, written by Peter Beilharz, and I'm all done. So thanks for listening.